Want me to just do a autobiography? Okay. Okay, well, I was born in 1952 in Montreal at the Royal Victoria Hospital. And I grew up the first 5 years of my life in the Côte-des-Neiges area of Montreal, which coincidentally is where I now work at the Jewish General Hospital in that same quartier. When I was 5, my family moved to Île-Jésus, north of Montreal, to what at the time was Saint-Martin, which eventually became Chambéry, which eventually became Laval. And that's where I grew up till my teenage years. And I mention this not just because it's a simple place to begin, but also because my childhood was important for my long-term interests, because I come from a family that was very alive and alert to social issues. My father grew up in the Eastern Townships. He grew up in a bilingual community, so he was very comfortable in both French and English. And he came from a small town, Coaticook, in the Eastern Townships to Montreal to go to university. And his friends at that time were from all over. He had a close friend from Jamaica and so on. So the connection to people from different places and interest and respect for their diverse lives was something that I grew up with as part of my parents' values. And I saw my personal interest, my personal orientation as largely in continuity with that. Having said that, my interest as a child was really in science and particularly in physics, and I wanted to be a theoretical physicist. So that continued through my high school years when I was reading omnivorously and had many influences, a wonderful English teacher who was a huge influence on me and other people. And then I started McGill at 16. I skipped a grade and I started McGill at 16, and at the time there were no cégeps, no colleges in Quebec, but we were transitioning to that system, so McGill actually created a cégep temporarily. So I had 2 years at McGill as in cégep, in effect, before 3 years as an undergraduate. And those 2 years were in math and physics. I was going, as I say, on that track. There was honors physics, which was a very small group of people, so it was very stimulating, small classes, excellent professors, very literate and just interesting in the way that they presented very deep ideas. But I realized in the process that my mathematical ability was, at least in that context, average. And that's not enough to be a theoretical physicist. You have to really have a talent for that. And I think I had a great interest, but not necessarily skills commensurate with that. So given that I had many other interests, I was sort of looking around, and I discovered that the psychology course that I took, I did very well in without even trying. So then I thought, well, if I try, maybe I can really do something more substantial. So I switched after 2 years in math, physics, and taking a variety of introductory courses and different things. I switched to psychology at McGill. And again, I was in an honors psychology program, so it was only about 20 people. We had a lot of small seminars and so on, and we had a lot of tutorial method teaching. So it was unusual for McGill, which often has big classes and rather impersonal kind of academic environment. So that was also very stimulating. And I had my teaching at that time still was D.O. Hebb, a very famous psychologist who has had a lot of influence on contemporary work in neuromodeling and brain theory and so on, which I'll come to later on in our discussions because it's something I was able to return to a little bit in recent years. And I had another supervisor for my junior honors thesis was Ron Melzack, who's very famous for his work on pain and pain control, gate control theory of pain and other work that he did. And interestingly, work that Melzack's work really tried to show the relationships between the nervous system and learning and environment. So again, that is a theme that we'll come back to. And then because of the sort of tutorial structure of these things, I had one semester course, there was only one other student in it, me and him and the professor, on the history of the limbic system. So we were looking at how a neuroanatomical structure emerged as an object of discourse in science and so on. So it was an unusually, what can we say, sort of historically situated and reflective approach to what at the time was called physiological psychology. Another one of my teachers at the time was Peter Milner, who's famous for having discovered pleasure centers or reward centers in the brain. So it was a very stimulating time with exposure to a lot of interesting ideas and an approach to psychology that I should say was very empirical, very experimental, and not like a lot of psychology courses elsewhere where most people are interested in psychology because they're interested in clinical psychology, they're interested in psychopathology and human personality and so on. This was a lot of animal psychology, partly because of saying, well, human beings are animals, but also because we can study things in a more rigorous way than we can, and so on. So this whole philosophy that sometimes gets derided now as a positivist philosophy, let's say, was very much part of how I was being shaped to think at that point. And again, having come from physics, the hard science kind of into this milieu, where there was still a big preoccupation with the scientific foundations of psychology. How solid a science is this? And I remember reading a book on phenomenology and hermeneutics and psychology, and raising exactly some of the dilemmas. So that was the background to my exposure then to this more physiological psychology, to cognitive psychology, and to some extent to social psychology as an undergraduate. As I neared the end of that period, the question was, what was I going to do next? And in my mind, my plan was to go into clinical psychology. And I applied to a lot of clinical psychology programs, and I got into most of them. And I had decided that I was going to go to Waterloo, University of Waterloo, to work with Donald Meichenbaum and Kenneth Bowers. Donald Meichenbaum was an important figure in cognitive behavior therapy, sort of emergence of cognitive behavior therapy, and Ken Bowers studied hypnosis, which was, I thought, a very interesting topic. And I'd had some playful experimentation with hypnosis as an undergraduate. There was a book by Robert Masters, I'm not sure his name, anyway, a book called The Master Game. There was all these exercises of using imagery and imagination and so on, essentially kind of self-hypnosis that you could do in a group. And it also referred a lot to the work of Milton Erickson, who was an important psychologist, psychiatrist, hypnotherapist, if you will, in the mid last century. So all this was sort of influencing me to be very interested in clinical psychology and wanting to do something that was sort of people-centered and helping profession with the feeling that that would be socially responsible and doing something constructive to help other people, but also intellectually interesting. And I could say that for me there was continuity with my earlier intellectual interest in the sense of really being interested in the nature of knowledge. How do we know what we know? And at the same time, I had been exposed, one of my friends, Steve Aronson, who went on to become a psychiatrist, had invited R.D. Laing to come visit McGill. And R.D. Laing was an important, what can we say, philosopher, psychiatrist, counterculture figure in some ways in the 60s. He'd written very profound, I guess in some sense, critiques of psychiatry and the origins of madness, quote unquote. So he was a fascinating figure, and I got to meet him and listen to his talk. And he had a very strong institutional critique of psychiatry, as a social institution of control and of pathologizing what were maybe people simply protesting the injustices and the unhealthy aspects of our society and so on, coming at it from to some extent a Marxist perspective, even more phenomenological, existential, philosophical perspective. So that was very important to me, and I thought I wanted to somehow do things differently, be involved with psychology, clinical psychology, working with people with mental health problems in a way that was constructive. So I was all set to go to graduate school to do a PhD, and the graduate school in psychology clinical psychology has the model of a clinician scientist. So you learn clinical work, but you also learn to do research and to have those skills and that way of thinking. And that's the model. At the same time, I had applied to medical school because that's what everybody in honors psychology was doing. That was one path to medical school, apparently. That was one, you got a degree in honors psychology, and then you had a good chance of getting into medical school. So I had done that. I applied to that too, and I applied to a bunch of medical schools. I didn't get into most of them, and part of the reason why, in terms of medical school, was my undergraduate career was what can we say, polarized. I did either very well or not well at all, depending upon how interested and how engaged I was in the particular course. So that didn't look very good on my GPA or whatever it was. In any event, I remember very distinctly, so I'll tell personal stories as we go, but very distinctly that when I did get a letter then from McGill saying you've been accepted to medical school. And I remember calling my mother, my parents, to say, guess what, I got accepted to medical school. And they said, oh, fantastic, what are you going to do? And I said, well, you know what I'm going to do. I'm going to graduate school in psychology. So it's nice that I got into medical school, but that's not my plan. And I told this story just recently to students, kind of as I was talking. We were talking about individualistic and collectivistic selves or familistic selves, and saying that even though we live in a very individualistic culture, and most of us are oriented that way, it remains that families are important and families have strong ties. So the fact that when I said that, my mother gave a heavy sigh of disappointment, because it implied in her framework that's not being a real doctor. A real doctor is an MD. A PhD, well, that's something else. In my mind, it was exactly the opposite, that MDs are tradespeople. They have technicians. They do, they fix things, fix people, fix cars, whatever, And PhDs are intellectuals and, study things and so on. So in my own temperament, my own orientation, that was clear. However, my reaction of my parents was, well, this is a big decision. Maybe you should look into it a bit more. We'll connect you to some of our friends who have different perspectives. Why don't you go talk to them? So I went to talk to someone who was a psychologist, and I went to talk to someone who was a psychiatrist, actually at the time, Herta Gutman, who was a psychiatrist who went on to be head of psychiatry here at the Allen, and who was married to a cousin of my father's. And the message I got from her and from everyone was, well, there is a hierarchy, a political hierarchy in mental health, in which psychiatry, at least in Quebec and many places, is at the top. And if you're critical of the system and you want to change things, you'll have more leverage and more power if you do psychiatry. So that was convinced me, that was a compelling argument for political reasons to say, okay, I think I have to go to medical school. But with the idea that I'm going to medical school only because I'm going to psychiatry. I have no desire to be a surgeon or family doctor or anything else. It's very much I want to do mental health work and research and practice. So I went to medical school, which was a bit of a shock because I had come from physics, honors physics, where the emphasis was not on memorizing anything, it was on problem solving. All our exams were open book exams. You need to look up a formula, look up the formula. The question is, how do you think? To medical school, which was how many facts can you cram into your head and spit out when you're going around and doing rounds and so on. So it was really difficult and very, to me, almost anti-intellectual in the atmosphere. Science was very much from the point of view of just here are facts and here are recipes. So I constantly, all through medical school, kept preparing applications to graduate school somewhere else to kind of leave and quit. And I went on that way, doing okay. I focused a lot on psychiatry, and I did some electives, and those were interesting and so on. But the signal event that happened, and I should say, just to go back, as an undergraduate, I only had one anthropology course, since the point of the story is about anthropology, which is where we're heading. I know this is a long, winding road here. I'd had one anthropology course, introductory anthropology course, which I had at McGill in this big Morris Hall, big classroom, and I remember Fumiko Aikawa-Smith, I think, was the professor. There were other people teaching. And I was very disappointed in the course, because to me, anthropology was some kind of integrative approach that brought everything together. So it was very exciting from that point of view. And what we got was a lot of very focused things, including a long section on kinship, which I just could not get excited about. I just did not understand. It was back to the medical, or not back, but anticipating the medical school thing of like all these minute facts and you know, whatever. So it did not inspire me. I did write at that time, so I'm going back now to, this would be probably about 1969, 1970. I wrote an essay, term paper, whatever, final paper for that course called Toward a Model of Man, the Psychobiocultural Investigation of the Human Nervous System. So this gives you a flavor of my intellectual grandiosity as a 17-year-old or whatever. The teaching assistant who marked it called me in and said, I hope you didn't write this just for this course, because it was like way overkill for what they were expecting. Anyway, that was my exposure, total exposure to anthropology at that point, aside from things I was reading on my own. But back to medical school now, you know, because I had 2 years in math physics, 3 years in psychology, and now in medical school, 4 years in medical school. And the final year of medical school, a lot of it medical school, so the first year and a half is all being bombarded with all these courses and learning all these languages, which was interesting. It was presented to us like you're going to learn thousands of new words which relate to descriptive levels of, you know, biology, and so you'll have these vocabularies. So that was very interesting. I felt like, okay, I'm learning how to read literatures that otherwise I would not be able to engage with. But, you know, integrative ideas were not at the center. And then the middle part of medical school is all apprenticeship. You're going around and you're seeing patients and you're being given more and more responsibility to give clinical care. And that was more interesting and rewarding to me, but also troubling, because I felt oftentimes that patients were being treated as objects, as passive objects. You know, one of the classic forms of medical school is you go around, you do rounds, and you have a staff person who's discussing the patient with a bunch of medical students around. And I remember episodes where the staff person was talking as though the patient was not there, about them in the third person, and I just wanted to leave the room. I just could not stand it. It offended me so much. It was really a problem for me. It was really like, I'm in the wrong place. This is not the way that I would want to be treated. It's not the way anybody should be treated. So it was a problem. It is a problem, but it certainly was a problem. And, you know, not all physicians, and there were great other examples of people who were wonderful and wonderfully humane, but it was a problem. Anyway, so the last year of medical school, McGill at the time had a very interesting curriculum in which you had 3 months where it was called Back to Basics. And you went back to the classroom and you took only 2 courses a month, one in the mornings, one in the afternoons. So for 3 months you took only 6 courses. Each one was like a month long, half days. And they were all kinds of wonderful topics. So I took a course with Don Bates, a medical historian, called Ivan Illich and His Critics. So Ivan Illich was an important, you know, social critic of medicine. And so it was a whole month of reading his stuff and discussing it and whatever. So that was all kinds of things like that are wonderful. The course that really, for me, was most important was Margaret Locke, an anthropologist who ended up, you know, having a long and illustrious career at McGill, had just come from Berkeley, where she had done her PhD with George DeVos and others. And in fact, I don't think she'd actually received her degree. It was like, you know, she was finished, but not in that period in between, kind of. But she came on faculty at McGill. And she taught a course within these little elective courses for medical students on, what did she call it now? Ethnopsychiatry or something like that. And so this, for me, was a revelation. And we read Takeo Doi's first Japanese psychoanalyst book, The Anatomy of Dependence, and we read a bunch of interesting things, and I just thought, like, it was like a bolt of lightning. This is what I want to do. This is at the intersection of all of my interests: mental health, culture, the nature of knowledge, sort of epistemic questions, human values, you know, it all sort of coalesced. So I was extremely excited by that. I became friends with Margaret actually during medical school. We socialized, we really, so that was also important, I think, in terms of mentorship and feeling beginning to imagine a possible direction, not just being, okay, the professor's up there and, I'll never get from here to there, or it's very unclear, more like, okay, this is somebody I'm in conversation with now, and we share interests and we can have discussions, and so it was something very exciting. So that was medical school. End of medical school, and then I had psychiatric residency. And I applied for psychiatric residencies in many places. I didn't want to stay at McGill because at that point I'd been at McGill 2 years cégep, 3 years undergraduate, 4 years medical school. It's really not healthy. The fact that I've ended up here back in McGill is probably altogether a problem, but anyway, so it was time to go somewhere else. And I had a roommate at the time who was from the States, from New York, and whose dream was to go to California, and he was always telling me, you should go to California, you should go to California. The promised land. So I applied to many places, and I ended up deciding to go to the University of California, Davis, to do a residency in psychiatry for a number of interesting reasons, I think. One was it was the place where the residents, the trainees, seemed to have a huge amount of freedom in choosing what they wanted to do. So I think my whole life I've been a sort of self-guided learner, somebody who sort of reaches out and mainly through books and through people sort of finds what he needs. So this appealed to me. It was also, there was a number of people there who did Jungian analysis, and I was very interested in Jung. I'd done during medical school, actually my second year of medical school, I went to Naropa Institute in Boulder, Colorado, which was a Buddhist college that had just been founded by Chogyam Trungpa, Tibetan Rinpoche. And I had a lot of interesting experiences there. I met, Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs and all kinds of, wild and crazy things. But one thing that I did was meet a woman called Renee Nell, who was a Jungian analyst who'd been analyzed by Jung, who'd come to the United States and had set up a therapeutic community for post-psychotic young adults. So young people had a psychotic episode and whose family could afford very nice residential care. And so for a month as a medical student, I worked in that community, and I became very interested in Jungian psychology as a way of engaging with imagery, with fantasy, with the spontaneous imagination on its own terms, not in sort of reductive terms. This spoke already to me to a tension between Freudian psychology and Jungian psychology, where Freudian ideas tend to be a bit reductive, like, this thing means something specific, whereas Jung saw symbols as the most basic representation of an idea or a value or an orientation. In any event, Jungian psychology was available there. It was near the Mental Research Institute, which was a place where Gregory Bateson and Don Jackson had founded a program, so I was able to do workshops there. And unbeknownst to me, Byron Good and Mary Jo Good had come the same year that I came for training. They had come as faculty to work at UC Davis. So Byron as an anthropologist, Mary Jo a sociologist who'd worked collaboratively in Iran and who were close colleagues of Arthur Kleinman, who's really a key figure in a kind of renaissance of cultural psychiatry and anthropology. So with Byron and Mary Jo, having come off this interaction with Margaret Locke, we started a reading group in their home and read anthropological, especially psychological anthropological texts, Robert Levy's The Tahitians, Michelle Rosaldo, Knowledge and Power, and we had Michelle Rosaldo came, we read her book and she came and we talked to her. So this is sadly a few years before she died. And so I had this informal, and this is sort of the whole trajectory, which I'm only getting partway through in this first chunk, but this is the trajectory of how I got exposed to anthropology through this kind of, opportunities that arose that let me get engaged in a very intensive way with key texts and with people, in conversation with people. So that was a very important experience. Went on for several years at UC Davis. Byron and Mary Jo worked with a psychiatrist there, Hank Herrera, to establish a consultation service that tried to bring local healers together with patients. That became a model for something that we later did here in Montreal. And then when I came back to Montreal in 1980, 81, I discovered that really for the first time clearly in my mind that McGill had this whole program in transcultural psychiatry that I'd not been really aware of. And so that became something that I could begin to engage with. And the other thing that happened when I came back was we started a reading group in my living room with Margaret took part sometimes, but also David Howes, who went on to be chair of Sociology and Anthropology at Concordia, John Levitt, linguistic anthropologist at University of Montreal. And so again, that was how I began to fill in the gaps in my education. We'd have some discussion and they would say Durkheim so-and-so, and I'd say Durkheim who? And I would go off and read Durkheim. And so I got this, again, crash course of what one would ordinarily get, in a more systematic way through these conversations. So I know we're getting near the end here, but I have a couple of more chunks. So you may want to throw away some of the early stuff and put it together with this other stuff, because what I have to talk about now is coming back to Montreal and discovering at Montreal not only transcultural psychiatry, which at the time was very modest, it shrunk down to really just being a few people, but GERAM, which was this inter-university research group in medical anthropology and ethnopsychiatry that was founded by Guy Debreuil at University of Montreal and Henry Murphy at McGill. And that was a very significant community, I would say, intellectual community in many ways. It brought together people with common interests in medical anthropology and ethnopsychiatry. It was at a time when linguistic tensions were quite intense in Montreal. It was a truly bilingual environment. People typically moved back and forth fluidly and often spoke the language of the other out of respect. It just moved. So it was, for me, actually, having grown up here, this was the first time I began to perceive that we were in a bilingual milieu, or we could be in a bilingual milieu, and it could be a good thing. It could be a very elegant and very enriching thing. So not probably related very directly to the fact that we're talking about culture, and we're talking about Montreal as an intersection between North American and European ideas about culture and about anthropology. So that was very significant for me, formative in many ways. And coming out of that experience, the key mentors were, Ellen Corin, Gilles Bibot, mainly the two of them and other people who really sort of fostered my further development in this direction. So I'm just aware that we need to pause at some point. I don't know where we're at, so let's just pause and I'll tell you more about Gérard because that was very significant. So.